Picture this. You're trudging up a muddy slope, shoulder to shoulder, with 5,000 other Scottish soldiers. The sky above you turns black. A swarm of English arrows begins its terminal descent. Your survival instinct overrides your training. You tuck your chin into your chest to shield your face with the rim of your steel helmet. That reflex just killed you. By tilting your head forward, you unwittingly pull the chainmail tight against your throat. You open a lethal gap between the base of your skull and your armor. A single heavy bodkin arrow falling from the clouds slides perfectly into this exposed vulnerability, severs your spinal cord with surgical precision. You collapse instantly. You aren't dead yet. You're simply paralyzed, forced to stare helplessly at the mud while the next volley massacres the men behind you. This specific mechanical brutality defined the Battle of Halidon Hill. Before we analyze how this massacre changed warfare forever. If you enjoy uncovering the grim mechanics of history, please hit that like button and subscribe. Leave a comment below telling me which historical battle you think was the most unjust. I read every single one. To understand why this slaughter happened, we must strip away the romance of chivalry. The year is 1333. England is a pariah state. 19 years earlier, at the Battle of Bannockburn, the Scots had humiliated the English military, wiping out their heavy cavalry in a single afternoon. That defeat broke England's spirit, forced them to sign the Treaty of Northampton, recognizing Scottish independence. But the new King of England, Edward III, does not care about treaties. At 20 years old, he is cold, pragmatic, and obsessed with revenge. He despises the memory of his father's failure. He knows that the traditional English way of war, charging on horseback like glory-seeking fools, is obsolete. Failed at Bannockburn, it would fail again, so Edward reinvents the game. Looks at the longbow, a weapon previously despised by the aristocracy as a tool for poachers, and he sees a machine gun. He realizes that if he can combine mass archery with a defensive position, he doesn't need to chase the Scots. He can simply melt them. He needs a laboratory to test this new theory. He chooses the port city of Berwick-upon-Tweed. Edward marches north, not to conquer, but to provoke. He lays siege to Berwick with a brutality that shocks his contemporaries. He chokes the city's supply lines. He destroys its infrastructure. He creates a humanitarian crisis so severe that the Scottish army is forced to leave their defensive strongholds to save it. The Guardian of Scotland, Archibald Douglas, takes the bait. He marches south with a massive host, confident in his numbers, fueled by the memory of past victories. He expects a battle of swords and courage. He does not realize he is walking into a physics equation that Edward has already solved. Dord positions his army at Halidon Hill. He orders his knights to do the unthinkable, get off their horses, places them on foot, shoulder to shoulder with the common archers. He uses the terrain to funnel the Scots into a narrow, muddy choke point. He waits. This is not a story about a battle. It is the story of how a young king turned an army into an industrial slaughterhouse and how the Scots marched straight into the grinder. Edward III arrived at Berwick in May 1333. He set up his camp at Halidon Hill overlooking the besieged city. By late May, the English siege lines were a masterwork of medieval engineering. The king ordered the construction of a massive ditch and earthen rampart that completely encircled the landward side of the city. He wasn't just keeping the Scots in. He was keeping any potential relief force out. At sea, a fleet of English ships blockaded the river mouth, their masts like a floating forest, ensuring not a single sack of grain could reach the docks. Inside the walls, the situation devolved rapidly. The governor of Berwick, Sir Alexander Seton, looked out from the battlements and saw his doom. The English bombardment was relentless. Great stone-throwing engines pounded the walls day and night. But the true enemy wasn't the stone. It was the silence of empty bellies. As weeks turned into months, the food stores dwindled. The horses were slaughtered first, then the dogs. Finally, the citizens began to eye the rats with predatory intent. Disease began to stalk the cramped alleyways. Archibald Douglas, the Guardian of Scotland, knew he was running out of time. He had gathered a massive army, perhaps as many as 15,000 men, but he was paralyzed by indecision. He knew attacking a dug-in English army was suicide. But he couldn't let Berwick fall. It would be a political catastrophe his fragile leadership could not survive. So Douglas tried to play a clever game. Instead of marching to Berwick, Douglas marched his army south deep into England. He crossed the Tyne and began to burn the English countryside, torched villages, stole cattle, and spread terror throughout Northumberland. His logic was sound. If he caused enough pain to English civilians, Edward would be forced to lift the siege and come chase him. Douglas even raised the stakes personally. He marched on Bamburgh Castle, where Edward's young wife, Queen Philippa, was staying. He besieged. The Queen, hoping the threat to his wife would drag Edward away from Berwick. It was a brilliant gambit. Against any other king it might have worked, but Edward III was not any other king. When messengers arrived with news that Northumberland was burning and his own wife was threatened, Edward didn't flinch. Simply looked at the smoke rising on the southern horizon and essentially said, "Let it burn." Edward called Douglas's bluff. He calculated that Bamburgh Castle was strong enough to hold, and he knew that the prize of Berwick and the destruction of the Scottish army was worth the temporary suffering of his own subjects. This cold-blooded strategic patience terrified the Scots. Back in Berwick, hope broke. On July 15th, with the granaries empty and the walls crumbling, Sir Alexander Seton signaled for a parley. He offered a conditional surrender. The terms were specific and fatal. Seton agreed that if the Scottish army did not relieve the city, by sunset on July 19th, Berwick would open its gates and surrender to England. This agreement changed everything, transformed the vague strategic situation into a ticking clock. For Berwick to be considered saved, 200 Scottish men-at-arms had to physically fight their way through the English lines and cross the bridge into the city. Edward III smiled when he signed the paper. He had exactly what he wanted. He had forced Archibald Douglas into a corner. But Edward had one more psychological twist of the knife to ensure Douglas attacked in blind rage. The negotiations had involved hostages. Sir Alexander Seton had given his own son, Thomas Seton, to Edward as collateral to guarantee the treaty. As the deadline approached, Edward decided the terms had already been breached. He ordered the gallows to be erected right in front of the city walls in plain view of the battlements where Sir Alexander Seton stood watching. Chivalry is often painted as a code of honor, a set of rules that civilize the savage business of war. But at Berwick, Edward III took that code, crumpled it up, and threw it into the mud. On the morning of the deadline, Edward ordered the guards to bring out Thomas Seton. Thomas was not a soldier. He was a hostage, the son of the governor defending the town. Under the normal rules of war, hostages were pawns to be traded, not victims to be executed. But Edward needed to send a message that would vibrate through the spine of every Scotsman watching. The English carpenters built a gallows on high ground, directly in the line of sight of the city walls. Sir Alexander Seton and his wife stood on the ramparts, paralyzed. They watched as the English soldiers led their son up the wooden steps. There was no last-minute reprieve. There was no mercy. The trapdoor opened. The rope snapped tight. Comus swung in the wind, a grim pendulum, marking the end of English patience. The shock of this execution broke the stalemate. Archibald Douglas and the main Scottish army arrived on the scene just in time to witness the aftermath or hear the screaming reports of the atrocity. The sight of the gallows stripped Douglas of his tactical options. He was the guardian of Scotland. He had already failed to protect the border. Now he had failed to protect the son of his own governor. The political pressure on his shoulders transformed into an unbearable weight. If he turned away now, he was a coward who let boys hang while he commanded 15,000 spears. If he attacked, he was a fool fighting on the enemy's chosen ground. Douglas looked up at Halidon Hill. The sight was a nightmare for any commander. The English were not just on a hill, they were on the hill. Edward had deployed his army in 3 distinct divisions. From the Scottish position in the valley below, the English looked like a wall of steel fused with the horizon. They had a commanding view of every approach. To get to them, the Scots would have to descend from their own position, cross a flat expanse of marshland, and then climb a long, steep slope of roughly 500 yards. Edward had deliberately left the entry to the bog open. It was an invitation. Come and get me. Douglas held a war council. His captains were furious, their blood boiling. From the execution of Seaton and the destruction of their homeland, the younger nobles clamored for a charge. They argued that their superior numbers would overwhelm the English line if they could just make contact. They spoke of Bannockburn, where they had pushed the English into the river. They'd forgot that. At Bannockburn, the English had attacked them. Logic was drowned out by rage. Douglas gave the order. The Scottish hosts began to move. They dismounted. This was standard Scottish doctrine, to fight on foot in massive formations called schiltrons. These were tight phalanxes of spearmen bristling with 12-foot pikes designed to stop cavalry charges. The plan was simple. March through the bog, weather the arrow storm, smash into the English line with the sheer weight of thousands of bodies. As the Scots formed up into 3 massive columns, the sky was clear. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the kill zone. The English waited in eerie silence. No trumpets, no war cries, just the rustle of silk standards and the creaking of yew wood. Archibald Douglas took his place at the head of the center division. He stepped into the marsh. The mud sucked at his boots. The water rose to his shins. The trap was sprung, while Archibald Douglas was making the emotional decision to attack. Edward III was making a mathematical one, standing on the crest of Halidon Hill. The young king looked at his army and decided to break the fundamental rule of medieval warfare. He grounded the aristocracy. In 1333, the knight was defined by his horse. To separate a knight from his mount was to lower him to the rank of a peasant. But Edward had seen the future. He realized that a mounted charge against Scottish spears was suicide, but a solid wall of dismounted steel was immovable. He ordered every single knight earl and baron to send their horses to the rear. This psychological masterstroke accomplished 2 things. First, it removed the temptation to ride down the enemy in a glory-seeking, disorganized charge. Second, it told the common infantrymen standing nearby, "We are not leaving. We will live or die on this patch of grass with you," solidified the line into a single cohesive organism. Edward organized his force into 3 distinct divisions, but the genius wasn't in the center. It was on the edges. Instead of placing his archers behind the infantry to shoot over their heads, Edward pushed them forward. He arranged the longbowmen on the flanks of each division in V-shaped wedges. Imagine the English line not as a straight wall, but as a series of funnels. The dismounted knights formed the flat base of the funnel. The archers projected out on either side in V-shaped wedges. This geometry created a deadly crossfire zone. The Scots tried to attack the knights in the center. They wouldn't just be shot from the front. They would be shot from the left and the right simultaneously. When an arrow strikes a man from the front, it has to punch through the thickest part of his armor. But when arrows come from the side, they bypass the shield entirely. They find the thinner armor on the arms, the armpits, and the sides of the helmet. Edward had essentially built a machine gun nest out of human bodies. The archers manning these wedges were not conscripts. They were professionals raised from childhood with a bow in their hands. They wielded the English war bow, a weapon with a draw weight of over 100 pounds. These men were essentially biological artillery. They carried 2 sheaves of arrows, 48 rounds of ammunition, stuck into their belts, or the ground for rapid access. They stood on the high ground looking down at the bog where the Scots were beginning to wade, the sun at their backs, and the wind in their favor. Edward's setup transformed the battlefield into a conveyor belt. The Scots would be fed into the bog, slowed by the mud, funneled by the terrain, and then subjected to a triangulated storm of missiles before they could even swing a sword. The tragedy of Halidon Hill is best understood not by looking at the soldiers, but by looking at the ground beneath their feet. To reach the English, the Scots had to descend their own slope, cross a valley floor composed of soft waterlogged peat, and then climb the steep gradient of Halidon Hill itself. Douglas ordered his men to form schiltrons. At Bannockburn, these formations had absorbed the shock of heavy cavalry. The schiltron was the perfect defensive anvil, but on this day, Douglas tried to use the anvil as a hammer. As the three massive Scottish divisions rolled down the slope, they maintained their shape. But the moment they hit the valley floor, the geometry of the battle turned against them. The marsh was a bog. As thousands of iron-shod boots stomped into the wet earth, the ground churned into a quagmire. The precise lines began to waver. Men slipped. The heavy 12-foot spears became clumsy balancing poles. To avoid sinking or getting stuck, the soldiers instinctively huddled closer together. The formation compressed. This was the fatal error. Sheltrin relies on spacing to allow soldiers to wield their weapons. As the mud forced them to bunch up, the Scots lost their ability to fight individually. They became a single slow-moving target struggling just to stay upright. From the top of Halidon Hill, Edward III watched the Scottish army degrade from a military formation into a mob. He saw the struggle in the mire, saw the steam rising from thousands of sweating armored bodies laboring in the summer heat. The Scots were now in the kill zone. They had left the safety of their ridge, but they had not yet reached the English lines. They were waist-deep in the problem, moving at a crawl, presenting the densest possible target profile to the English archers waiting above. The physics of the terrain had already defeated the Scottish doctrine. The bog had stripped them of their momentum. The slope ahead would strip them of their stamina, and the English longbows were about to strip them of their lives. The horror of Halidon Hill wasn't just the killing. It was the waiting. As the Scottish vanguard finally dragged themselves out of the sucking peat of the bog, they were greeted not by a flat field, but by a lung-bursting uphill gradient. They were already exhausted. Their legs burned from the effort of wading through the mire and 60 pounds of mail and plate. Their breath fogged inside their helmets, and they were still 200 yards away from the enemy. This is the moment where the English archers earned their pay. In medieval warfare, an archer wasn't a sniper. He was a volume shooter. The goal wasn't to pick off an individual from a football field away. It was to put so much lethal iron in the air that walking through it became a mathematical impossibility. Edward III waited. He watched the Scots stumble up the lower slopes, gasping for air, their formations already beginning to clump together from the terrain. He let them get closer. He wanted them fully committed, past the point of no return. Then a single signal rippled down the English line. 5,000 longbowmen stepped forward, planted their left feet, pushed their bows out, and drew the heavy yew staves back to their ears. The sound of thousands of bows being drawn simultaneously is often described in chronicles as a deep, creaking groan, like a ship breaking apart in a storm. They loosed. The first volley didn't fly flat. It arced high into the summer sky, reaching the apex of its trajectory before turning nose down. This was plunging fire. The arrows accelerated as they fell, accumulating kinetic energy from gravity. For the Scots on the slope, the sun suddenly disappeared. The noise of impact was not a clang, but a wet thud multiplied by thousands. The first rank of the Scottish advance didn't just stop. It evaporated. Arrows punched through shoulder guards, pierced thighs, and nailed feet to the ground. Men fell where they stood, becoming tripping hazards for the rank behind them. But the Scots were brave. Driven by desperation and the sheer momentum of the mass behind them, the survivors stepped over the dead and kept climbing. They lowered their heads against the storm, holding their shields aloft like umbrellas in a downpour. This played exactly into Edward's geometric trap. Because the English archers were positioned on the flanks in those V-shaped wedges, they weren't just shooting into the front of the Scottish shields. They were shooting into the sides of the formation. As the Scots climbed higher, the angle of fire shifted. The arrows began to find the gaps between the shield and the body. They struck the unarmored armpits of men, raising their weapons. Struck the backs of legs. The advance slowed to a crawl. It wasn't a charge anymore, it was a trudge into a gale-force wind. Only the wind was made of ash and steel. The Scottish front line was being shaved away layer by layer. But the rear ranks, blind to the slaughter ahead, kept pushing forward, crushing their own comrades against the invisible wall of English missiles. They were marching into a meat grinder, and the operator had just turned the handle to full speed, too. Understand why Halidon Hill became a graveyard. we have to look at the grim engineering of the English arrow. The archers were not firing broadheads. Those would have shattered against Scottish steel. They were firing bodkins. A bodkin is a chisel made of hardened steel, long square profiled, and tapering to a needle point. It is designed for one specific purpose: to defeat armor. The Scottish knights were wearing chainmail reinforced with a few plates. Against a bodkin arrow falling from a high trajectory, chainmail is dangerously flawed. The needle point hits a ring. It doesn't break it immediately. It spreads it. The kinetic energy delivered by a 150-pound draw weight drives the thick shaft through the widened ring. The arrow bursts through the mail, punching into the padded gambeson beneath and burying itself inches deep in flesh. But the horror was not just ballistic, it was hydraulic. As the English wings poured fire into the flanks of the Scottish columns, the Scots instinctively recoiled away from the arrows. The men on the right stepped left. The men on the left stepped right. They were compressing themselves into the center. Simultaneously, the thousands of men in the rear ranks, blind to the slaughter at the front, continued to push forward, eager to get to grips with the enemy. They shoved the men in front of them harder and harder. The result was a phenomenon modern safety experts call compressive asphyxia, or a crowd crush. The Scots in the center of the formation were no longer fighting the English. They were fighting for lung expansion. The pressure became so intense that men were lifted off their feet, suspended by the bodies around them. Their ribs cracked under the strain. Arms were pinned to sides, making it impossible to raise a shield or draw a weapon. They were crushed to death without ever being touched by an enemy soldier. Those at the very front managed to stumble up the hill, reaching within yards of the English line. They were exhausted, wounded, and terrified. They looked up at the English men-at-arms, who were fresh, rested, and standing on solid ground. English knights simply stepped forward. They didn't need defense. They used their poleaxes and hammers to smash the skulls of men who were too tired to lift their guards. It wasn't combat. It was harvesting. The Scottish attack dissolved into a writhing pile of metal and meat at the feet of the English army. The kill box had functioned perfectly. Arrows stopped the movement. The terrain compressed the mass. Crush did the killing. The collapse of an army is a terrifying psychological event. It doesn't happen man by man. It happens like a dam, bursting. One moment the Scottish line was a coherent suffering entity. The next, it was a stampede of terrified individuals. As the rear ranks realized the front ranks were being butchered, the instinct to survive overrode the instinct to fight. And ran. They dropped their spears. They threw away their heavy shields. They scrambled back down the slope they had just climbed, heading straight back into the marsh. This was the moment Edward III had been waiting for. Up until this point, the English knights had stood rooted to the ground, disciplined and defensive. Now the king gave the signal. Pages and squires waiting in the rear rushed forward with the war horses. The English men-at-arms mounted their horses. The English system had done its work. Now it was time for the traditional cavalry to finish the job. Edward issued a command that chilled the blood of even his own chroniclers: no quarter. In many medieval battles, capturing a noble was better than killing him. But Edward wasn't interested in gold. He wanted to break the spine of the Scottish nation so permanently that it could never threaten him again. He wanted political decapitation. The English cavalry thundered down the hill. They didn't have to fight. They just had to chase. The Scots, exhausted and bogged down in the marsh, were slow-moving targets. The pursuit lasted for miles, stretched all the way back to the border. The carnage was absolute. Archibald Douglas, the guardian of Scotland, the man who had tried to save Berwick, was found dead on the field. He didn't die in a glorious duel. He was likely cut down while retreating or crushed in the initial panic. An anonymous end for a man who carried the weight of a kingdom. But he was not alone. The roll call of the dead reads like a who's who of Scottish aristocracy. 6 earls fell that day, 70 barons, 500 knights. While modern historians adjust the figures, the disparity remains shocking. It is estimated that thousands of Scots died in the mud of Halidon Hill. The English losses were negligible, perhaps a few dozen men. The Scottish army didn't just lose a battle. They lost a generation of leadership. The governing class of the country was wiped out in a single afternoon, as the sun set on July 19th. The town of Berwick-upon-Tweed surrendered as promised. But the garrison looked out at a field that was no longer green. There was a carpet of bodies bristling with white-fletched arrows stretching from the hill to the bog. Edward III had his revenge. He had erased the shame of his father. Or, importantly, he had proven a thesis that would terrify Europe for the next 100 years. The age of the mounted knight charging blindly into glory was over. The age of the professional killer had begun. History is often taught as a series of isolated events. We learn about Halidon Hill. Then we turn the page and learn about the 100 Years' War. But in the mind of Edward III, there was no page turn. There was only a straight line. Halidon Hill was the laboratory. It was the proof of concept. On that muddy slope in Northumberland, Edward confirmed a tactical thesis that would dismantle the feudal order of Europe. He proved that a combination of dismounted knights, chosen terrain, and massed archery could destroy a superior force of attackers. He took this blueprint and he exported it to France. 13 years later, at the Battle of Crécy, Edward faced the cream of French chivalry. The French, like the Scots, believed in the unstoppable power of the heavy cavalry charge. And just like the Scots, they were cut to pieces by English longbows and finished off by dismounted men-at-arms. The same thing happened at Poitiers. Famously, nearly a century later, Henry V used the exact same playbook to slaughter the French at Agincourt. The ghosts of Halidon Hill haunt every one of those victories. The Scottish soldiers who died in the bog in 1333 were the unwitting test subjects for a military revolution that would dominate warfare for 100 years. For Scotland, the defeat was catastrophic, but not fatal. Scots refused to submit. They retreated to the hills, waged a brutal guerrilla war, and eventually the English puppet regime collapsed. Scotland remained independent. But the lesson of Halidon Hill remains terrifyingly relevant today. Archibald Douglas was not a stupid man. He was a brave, experienced leader. His failure was not a lack of courage. It was a failure of imagination. He fought the war he knew rather than the war he was facing. He relied on the tactics of the past, ignoring the technological and tactical shift that had rendered them obsolete. Edward III, by contrast, looked at the board without sentiment. He saw that the old rules no longer applied, so he wrote new ones in blood. The world is constantly changing. Technology shifts. Old certainties dissolve. And often, like the Scots at Halidon Hill, we find ourselves marching confidently into a future we do not understand, protected by armor that no longer works against a threat we cannot reach. Thank you for watching. You want to understand the next chapter in this saga of blood and innovation? Click the video on your screen, right? Now, about the Battle of Crécy, and don't forget to subscribe. We are building a library of history's most critical lessons,